Jackson, would you like to introduce Tom?
Sure. We've got with us this
From
morning.
your prison cell?
Speaking of prison cells, I will occasionally study in the basement of Lilly Library on the campus of Earlham College, and I see a tall man coming and going into a room, and that man is Tom Hamm, and I assume he is doing Quaker scholarship things in his office where he's no longer working for the college but works at the college and is an expert on all things Quaker North American. And it's an honor to have him here with us this morning on Zoom. He's going to give us what is it, the 20,000 feet from the air view of Quaker history. So, with that, Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jackson. I assume everyone can hear me. I never know how close I should be to these machines. Well, my assignment, as I understand it, is to give you a very brief overview of Quaker history, what I would call a mile wide and an inch deep. Today, we're going to be looking at the period from the beginnings of Quakerism in the 1640s up to about the year 1820. Then next month, we'll look at the last 200 years or so of Quaker history. So today we're going to be looking at foundations and maturity. Next month, we'll be looking at mainly the development of modern Quaker diversity, where you have a situation where Quakers around the world pretty much span the spectrum of religion from the most Bible thumping fundamentalists to the most liberal, universalist, tree hugging, chain yourself to the nuclear missile as a protest sort of activist. But today, beginnings. The roots of Quakerism lie in England in the 1640s. And if you know anything about English history, you know that this is a time of upheaval and tumult. There is a civil war going on that has Parliament on one side and King Charles I on the other. It is going to come to a climax in 1649 when Charles, having lost the war, is put on trial for treason by Parliament, convicted, and beheaded. There had been times previous to this in European history where monarchs had been overthrown and killed by their subjects, but this is the first time where you actually have a monarch being put on trial and convicted of crimes against his subjects. And for the next 11 years, from 1649 to 1660, there is no monarchy in England. Instead, it's a republic. One of the byproducts of this civil war is the breakdown of the power of the legally established Church of England. Before 1642, there was only one legal form of worship in England, the Protestant Church of England, as established by law. But with the war, its power broke down in many localities. And a result of this is that you have the appearance of dozens of new religious movements. Some of them, like Baptists and Presbyterians, had existed before, but their worship had been illegal. They'll go on, of course, to become major denominations. There are other smaller groups, many of them strange by any standard, with names like diggers or ranters or levelers, Brownists, Familists, Fifth Monarchists, my favorite, the Muggletonians, dozens of these. And of all of these strange little groups that appear in England in the 1640s, the only one that has survived down to the present day is the one that originally called itself the Children of the Light. Later, the Friends of the Light, ultimately the Religious Society of Friends, or Quakers. Now, at the heart of this movement is a young man named George Fox, who was born in Leicestershire in the Midlands of England in the year 1624. He came from a staunchly Puritan family, and by all accounts, including his own, he grew up a very pious, godly young man. It tells you something about George Fox that when other teenagers were dancing around maples on the village green or bowling at ninepins, George's idea of a good time was to go into the village pub and exhort the men there to give up their evil ways. George, of course, is coming of age in the midst of the Civil War, and he's deeply troubled by the competing claims of all of the religious groups that have emerged in England in the 1640s. About the only thing these groups have in common is that each claims to be the only true Christian church. If you're not one of us, you're going to be damned to everlasting hellfire. And George Fox is someone who definitely believes in the reality of hell and hellfire, and he wants to avoid it. So in the year 1644, he embarks on a kind of spiritual pilgrimage, traveling around southern England, seeking out people, both men and women, who have a reputation for piety or godliness, hoping that somebody can show him what the true Christian church is. But as Fox later wrote in his autobiography, there were none that could speak to my condition. So in 1646, 1647, he traveled up into the north of England, onto the moors of Yorkshire and Lancashire, places where even today, in many localities, you would find more sheep than people. And it was here that Fox had a series of experiences in which he was convinced that God had spoken directly to him. He called these experiences openings. We probably refer to them as revelations today. And these openings or revelations would become the foundation of the Quaker movement. Now, there were 5 openings that were essential, were central to George Fox's vision of what the true Christian church should be. The first of these was the reality of the inward light, or the light of Christ inwardly revealed in human beings. Fox believed that all people have within them a certain divine light, the light of Christ that illuminates everyone in the world, no matter where they are, no matter when they lived. Now, Fox argued that this is not something that is natural to human beings. It is something that God has placed within them. And it is something that can be a guide to us. If we are obedient to the leadings of the inner light, if we observe its admonitions, its rebukes when we do wrong, it will lead us into a life that is pleasing in the sight of God, and when we die, we will go to heaven. If you are disobedient to the inward light, if you do not follow its admonitions and leadings, then you run the risk that it could be extinguished. It can go out if it's ignored. And in that case, then you will be condemned to everlasting punishment. The second of Fox's openings, which is closely tied to the idea of the inward light, is his belief in direct revelation. Fox argues that revelation, direct communication between human beings and God, did not cease when the last book of the Bible was written. Instead, the same Holy Spirit or divine spirit that inspired the writers of the different books of the Bible still inspires human beings today. And so Fox and early Quakers argued that it was theoretically possible that God might decide that we needed some additional books to the Bible in addition to what we already had, although they never wrote anything that they made that explicit claim for. This idea of direct revelation, in turn, leads to the third of Fox's openings, which is how the first two, the inward light and direct revelation, should shape Christian worship and ministry. One of Fox's earliest openings had been, as he put it, being trained up at Oxford or Cambridge did not fit a man to be a minister of Jesus Christ. Fox is arguing that what is necessary to be a true Christian minister is to have a direct call from God, to be obedient to the leadings of the light within you, to be open to continuous unfolding divine revelation. Now, this does not mean that one should ignore the Bible. If you read George Fox's writings, and he left thousands of published pages behind him, it's clear that George Fox was saturated with both the Old and the New Testaments. Indeed, one later friend said that if somehow all of the Bibles in the world should be destroyed, you could reconstruct the Bible from George Fox's memory. He knew it that well. Nevertheless, Fox argues that in Christian worship, the written words of God should be subordinate to continuing revelation and the guidance that comes to us from the inward light. So for Fox, to be a minister is not necessarily to be academically trained. It doesn't really matter whether you know Greek or Latin. Through the inward light and direct revelation, you can get all of the knowledge that you need to preach, to teach, to be a guide to fellow Christians. And Fox argues that this is available to everyone, both male and female. Anyone can be qualified, can be called by God to teach and preach and minister with power that comes from God. Now, this is indeed a radical idea. The idea that women have just as much right to speak and preach and pray and instruct publicly as men do. Indeed, there was a saying in England in the 1640s, when women preach and butchers pray, the devils in hell make holiday. Previous religious institutions, particularly Presbyterians and the Church of England, had argued that one needed extensive education, knowledge of the Greek and Latin and Hebrew languages to be qualified for ministry. Fox discards all of that. This also shapes the nature of Quaker worship. Since the point of religion is to be open to the leadings of the inward light, to be open to direct revelation. When Quakers gather for worship, there is no prayer book to be followed as you would have in the Church of England. There is no set of rituals to be observed, one after another, on any Sunday morning. Instead, when Quakers gather for worship, they sit down and wait in silence, confident that if God has a message for this assembled group or meeting, then God will inspire someone to speak. On the other hand, if no one is inspired to speak, well, that is also valuable. To spend an hour or two in quiet contemplation and reverence, away from the noise and tumult and temptations of the larger world. Most accounts we have indicate that a completely silent Quaker meeting in the 17th century was the exception. Uh, Friends who preached often would go on for as long as 2 or 3 hours. And very few people questioned that this could be contrary to the will of God. They took instruction even from sermons that went that long. The fourth of Fox's leadings or openings is what he calls the Lamb's War. Now, the Lamb, of course, is one of the titles that is given to Jesus Christ, both in the Gospels, but especially in the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. Now, for a lamb to fight a war would seem to be self-contradictory, since lambs, of course, are among the gentlest of teachers. But Fox argues that all Christians are called to engage in this peculiar kind of warfare. The Lamb's War is experienced both inwardly and outwardly. The inward Lamb's War is the struggle we engage in, guided by the inward light, guided by direct revelation, to overcome the evil that is also found within us. Fox and early friends were pretty clear that they believed in the reality of original sin, but they also believed that human beings had the good within them that could overcome that. So, by warring against the sinful nature that may be within you, by warring against the temptations that beset you, you engage in the inward lamb's war. The outward lamb's war is more complicated, and sometimes you get different understandings of it from different Quakers. At times, Fox seems to see it as simply Christians trying to overcome evil in the larger world. At other times, he hints that he really does believe that the end of the world and the Battle of Armageddon are going to take place soon, and that he, George Fox, has been called by God and Jesus Christ to be the field marshal, the right hand man of Christ in the final battle of Armageddon. There is ongoing dispute among Quaker historians and scholars about just how important that idea of a final outward carnal battle would be. Fifth and final of Fox's openings is that Quakers and Christians generally are called on to be a plain people. And by plainness, we mean avoiding the outward vanities of the world, avoiding behaviors and conduct that puff up human vanity and pride that call attention to us. So Quakers do not wear elaborate ruffs and ribbons and laces. They do not decorate their homes or their bodies with unnecessary ornament. Instead, they try to dress and live with becoming modesty and simplicity, so that resources that might be given to worldly indulgence or display can be used for better purposes, such as meeting the needs of poor people around you. And plainness is going to eventually going to come to have a number of different implications, and we'll talk a little bit about those later. So, everybody with me so far? Then let's move on and see how George Fox makes these teachings into a religious movement. We know by 1649, Fox is preaching publicly. By 1650s, in the Midlands of England, he has attracted some followers, and he has been clapped into jail for vagrancy and blasphemy for the first time. After 1652, he begins to preach in the north of England, especially Yorkshire, Lancashire, Cumbria, and there he attracts thousands of followers. Indeed, the north proves to be an even more fruitful place for the development of early Quakerism than Fox's home region of the Midlands of England. Now, what we know about early Quakers suggests that they were mainly from the middle classes of English society, what we would call the yeomanry. They were farmers who had either the ownership of their own lands or long-term leaseholds. In the towns and villages, they were middling folks, small merchants, or skilled craftsmen. You find a few early Quakers who come from the gentry class, the upper class of England, but they're almost always younger sons, people who are not going to inherit substantial estates. Very few aristocrats, relatively few of the large English underclass, the poorest of English people, are attracted to Quakerism. There's also a lot of evidence that early Quakers were people who had belonged to dissenting religious movements before the rise of Quakerism. They had been Puritan critics of the established Church of England. A number of them had identified with the Baptists that had been around England since the middle of the 16th century. And particularly in the north of England, a lot of early Quakers had formerly been people who called themselves seekers, people who had gathered into congregations because they were dissatisfied with all of the other churches around them, but yet weren't entirely sure what God was calling them to be. A lot of seekers found the answer to their seeking in early Quakerism. By 1654, Fox had made a number of important converts, people who were going to become public friends, preaching friends, ministers themselves, and carry the Quaker message throughout the British Isles and, in some cases, to other parts of the world. The first minister, other than Fox, to emerge in the early Quaker movement was a woman named Elizabeth Houghton. Another woman, Margaret Fell, an aristocratic woman who lived at Swarthmore Hall in Lancashire, would be another one of Fox's most important early converts. Swarthmore Hall would become kind of a headquarters for the Quaker movement in the early 1650s. And there were men who proved to be extremely effective preachers, men like Edward Burrough, Francis Howgill, and a Yorkshire farmer named James Naylor. Indeed, there are some historians who would argue that before 1656, at least, that Naylor may have been as important to the early emerging Quaker movement as George Fox himself. In 1654, Fox decided that the time had come to carry the Quaker message into the rest of England, into Wales, into Ireland, into Scotland. And over the next 2 years, 60 or 70 public friends, preaching friends, who become known colloquially as the Valiant 60, carried the Quaker message into other parts of the British Isles. They drew many converts. We estimate that by the year 1660, there were probably between 50,000 and 100,000 people in the British Isles who were identifying themselves as Quakers. Very few in Scotland, a few among Protestant settlers in Ireland, a fair number in Wales, but the overwhelming majority of early converts to Quakerism are found in England. By 1660, there are so many converts in London that it is really coming to replace the north of England as the major Quaker center. And by 1660, Friends are traveling overseas. Public Friends are traveling to English colonies in the Caribbean and in North America. The first Friends reached the Chesapeake and New England in 1656. There are important Quaker communities, particularly on Barbados in the Caribbean, by 1660. There are a few Friends who are even more ambitious. A couple actually went to Rome with the idea of trying to convert the Pope to Quakerism. They ended up being clapped into a prison by the Inquisition, as you might imagine. There was also a Quaker woman named Mary Fisher who went to Constantinople because she thought God was calling her to preach to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. She didn't meet the Sultan, but she did have an audience with his prime minister, the Grand Vizier, who listened to her respectfully, told her that he thought she was indeed a godly woman, and made arrangements for her to be put on a trip back to England at the Sultan's expense. Quakers like to contrast the treatment of Quaker women by a Muslim ruler with the persecution that they often faced at the hands of so called fellow Christians. And indeed, by 1660, while Quakerism is making converts, it is also facing significant, vociferous, and determined opposition that often takes the form of persecution, both legal and illegal. There are lots of reasons for this. There's no question that many people in England by 1660 perceived Quakers as being just downright weird. The very name Quaker was originally an insulting nickname that was given to early Friends because of the belief that sometimes when Friends were in their meetings for worship, that when they were really moved by the Holy Spirit, they would shake and quake and bellow and roll around on the floor. Nobody called them holy rollers, but I suppose you could make that sort of comparison. You can dispute whether that actually happened. Well, what's important is that a lot of non Quakers believe that it is taking place. George Fox recorded that the first use of the name Quaker for Friends came when he was in a court in Derby in 1650. He exhorted the judge to tremble in the fear of the Lord, and the judge responded, "And quake thou, Quaker, before the majesty of the law," and sent Fox off to jail. The important role that women have in the early Quaker movement also makes them controversial. For many people, this is just too strange. The Quaker view of the spirituality of the sacraments, the renunciation of water baptism and physical communion, this also seems strange to a majority of people in England in the 1650s. Then there is Quaker behavior that by any standard is disruptive. Fox and other early Friends often felt themselves called by God to visit the worship of other religious groups, to listen to what the minister had to say, and then, if they thought it wrong, if they disagreed with it, to interrupt the service and instruct people on what truth really was. Needless to say, this was usually not well received by the people who were being interrupted. More than once, George Fox was literally kicked out of somebody else's religious service. Quakers also felt led by God to repudiate a lot of the practices of civility or politeness that marked you as a civilized person in 17th century England. Quakers refused to use titles like my lord or my lady. Quaker men did not remove their hats in the presence of superiors. Quaker women did not bow and curtsy. The thee and thou and thy language that's traditionally associated with Quakerism was another mark of this. What almost everybody has forgotten today is that originally thee and thou were the singular forms of the pronoun you. So in 17th century English grammar, it was correct for one to address another single person as thee or thou. Two or more people were you. The exception to this was if one was addressing someone to whom respect or deference should be shown. So if you were addressing a lord or a lady or a judge or a military officer, even that single lord or lady should be addressed as you. Similarly, children were supposed to show respect for their parents by addressing them as you, your father or mother. Quakers believed that such practices simply puffed up human vanity, and their insistence on addressing everybody as thee and thou drove the upper classes crazy. Then there was the Quaker practice of going naked as a sign. This is when a Quaker would feel led by God to appear naked in a public place. There were various reasons for this. Sometimes it was to show one's spiritual innocency. Sometimes it was designed to be an act of self-mortification and humiliation. Sometimes it was designed to show the spiritual nakedness of the opposers of Quakerism. Whatever the reason, obviously it created an impression that Quakers were strange people. And there is no question that Quakers often had a gift for controversy and vitriol. In debates, in public print fights, they gave as good as they got. Take, for example, this case. Quaker Mary Fell, writing to the Puritan minister of her local parish. His name was Lampet. Lampet, the plagues of God shall fall upon thee, and the 7 vials shall be poured out upon thee, and the millstone shall fall upon thee, and crush thee as dust beneath the Lord's feet. How can thou escape the damnation of hell? Mary Fell was 8 years old when she wrote that letter to the local minister. It tells you a lot that when George Fox wrote his longest book, which was published in 1659, it did not have a title like A Respectful Invitation to the Opposers of Quakerism to Come Together with Us and Engage in Mutually Respectful Dialogue. No, the title of George Fox's book, which was intended to be a refutation of every anti-Quaker book that had been published up to that time, was The Great Mystery of the Great Four Unfolded and Antichrist's Kingdom Revealed Unto Destruction. So you can understand why Quakers are often unpopular and controversial. The result of this is that they often face persecution. Sometimes it's extra legal, simply mobs setting on Quakers, but oftentimes Quakers find themselves called into court, accused most often either of vagrancy or blasphemy. This leads to fines and prison terms in England and Ireland and Scotland. Over here in the colonies, it actually led to executions. Puritan authorities in Boston between 1659 and 1661 actually hang for Quakers simply for being Quakers. The only time in American history where people are legally executed simply because of their religious beliefs. Another landmark involved James Naylor, who before 1656 is probably as effective a Quaker preacher as George Fox himself. In 1654, Naylor had relocated to London, had become a very effective and popular preacher there, but also experienced physical illness, and by 1656 seems to have been in some sort of mental crisis. He felt led to travel to Western England, and in the fall of 1656, entering the city of Bristol, which at that time was the second largest city in England, he feels called on by the inward light and the Holy Spirit to reenact Christ's entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. So his supporters wave branches and shout, Hosanna. The obvious implication is that James Naylor thinks that he is Jesus Christ come back to earth. This gets him not only thrown into jail on charges of blasphemy, but actually subjected to a public trial by Parliament that could have resulted in his death. Naylor avoids the death penalty, but he is imprisoned, branded, and clapped into the stocks. And after 1656, you can make a case that Quakers begin to tone down their act somewhat, that they're beginning to realize that perhaps there should be some limits to how far one should follow what is perceived as the leading of the Spirit. Everybody with me so far? All right, then, let's move on. Oliver Cromwell, the leader of England, the Lord Protector under the Republic, somebody who seems to have been at least respectful of the Quaker message, dies in 1658. And thereafter follows roughly 18 months of instability in the English government. Another Lord Protector, Richard Cromwell, Oliver's son, is installed, but he's very quickly pushed out of office. Eventually, it's the army that comes to control the English government. And in the spring of 1660, it recalls the exiled Prince Charles Stuart, oldest son of the executed King Charles I, to come back to England and to restore the monarchy. This has profound implications for Quakerism and Quakers. Now, King Charles II seems to have been a naturally tolerant man. He seems to have found Quakers to be rather amusing, but he is accompanied in the restoration of the monarchy by a parliament that equates religious dissent with sedition and treason, and by a restored Church of England that regards Quakers as being among the worst of heretics. So the result is that between 1660 and 1669, you get a number of laws passed by Parliament that make life miserable for Quakers. there is legislation that specifically outlaws Quaker worship. There is legislation that makes it illegal for any group of religious dissenters to assemble for worship, at least more than 5 of them. Quakers also find themselves facing legal difficulties because they refuse to pay tithes. These are taxes that are imposed by the legally established Church of England for the support of the Church of England. Friends believe that all worship and support of religion should be voluntary. They refuse to pay tithes. They often find themselves thrown into jail for that refusal. By 1660, Quakers have also come to the conclusion that no good Christian can take a legal oath. Friends base this on 2 arguments. One is the statement of Jesus himself in the gospel, where he tells his followers to swear not at all. Friends combine this with an argument that oaths imply a double standard, that you can be trusted to tell the truth only when you've taken an oath, when in fact Christians should tell the truth at all times under all circumstances. This creates lots of legal problems for Quakers. It means, for example, if somebody owes them money and they want to take that person to court to collect the debt to which they're justly entitled, they'll immediately fail in their legal case because they won't take an oath as to the facts at dispute in the legal case. Even more dangerous for Friends, however, is the fact that Restoration England sees oaths of loyalty as the best way to defend against a recurrence of rebellion and revolution. The law is that any adult in England can be called before a judge or a justice of the peace at any time and required to take an oath of loyalty to the king. Friends say that they are indeed loyal subjects of the king, but they cannot in good conscience take an oath. So basically, anytime you want to harass a Quaker, all you do is to confront them with this oath that they can't take. That will subject them to fines and or imprisonment. So beginning in the 1660s, Friends are going to face waves of persecution more serious than they've experienced before. Indeed, if you were an adult Quaker in England between 1660 and 1689, chances are almost certain that at some time you will have been fined or imprisoned or at least hauled into court because of your religious beliefs and the implications of those beliefs. Well, Friends respond to persecution in several ways. One is through organization. The system of monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, yearly meetings that is pretty much standard with Quakerism today comes about in the 1660s as a response to persecution. So also do specially organized Quaker groups like the Meeting for Sufferings in London, which is organized in 1672. These new forms of Quaker organization basically have 3 functions. First of all, they enforce discipline, try to maintain standards of behavior among people who have identified themselves as Quakers. Secondly, they can respond quickly to relieve sufferings. If, for example, a Quaker family finds itself facing destitution because property has been confiscated or because the parents have been thrown into jail, Friends will move in to make sure that the family is not left to suffer alone. Finally, these organizations can also engage in lobbying and petitioning. Quakers may not resist the law when it throws them into jail, but they are quite active in trying to convince the king and parliament that they should change laws that inflict such suffering on Friends and other religious dissenters. And indeed, by the 1670s, Quakers had become quite adept at using the English legal system to their advantage. They're quite active in employing attorneys who can poke holes in indictments and find technicalities that will allow Friends to be released from legal persecution. You also have a new generation of Quaker leaders emerging in the 1660s and 1670s, probably the most important of whom are William Penn and Robert Barclay. William Penn, who's born in 1644, comes from an aristocratic English background. His father was an admiral in the English Navy. The Penn family owned extensive estates in both England and Ireland. William himself has attended Oxford University. And when young William Penn publicly identifies as a Quaker around 1664, 1665, it creates a social scandal. This is major news in the English upper classes. Sort of be like Donald Trump Jr. today announcing that he's going to become an Amishman and go live on a farm in Pennsylvania without electricity. I mean, it's just as unthinkable that William Penn the Younger would turn Quaker. Yet he does, and emerges as a major Quaker minister, a leading Quaker writer, and somebody who can use his aristocratic convictions on many occasions to convince King Charles to release individual friends from prison. Another important Quaker leader who emerges in the 1670s is one of the few people in Scotland who is attracted to Quakerism, Robert Barclay, was born in 1648. Comes from a gentry family in Scotland, had spent time in France, had actually been educated by Jesuits in France, uh, and emerges partly as a Quaker preacher, but mostly as a Quaker writer. A book that he publishes in 1676 in Latin, which of course is the international language of scholarship at that time. English translation comes out in 1678. An apology for the true Christian divinity, as the same is held and set forth by the people called Quakers, is basically an attempt not only to defend Quakerism to the rest of the Quaker world, but also becomes a set of theological standards that Quakers are increasingly going to regard as binding on all friends. In particular, Barclay tangles with the problem of how do you avoid a situation where people, when following the inward light and the direct revelation, do things that are clearly wrong. And he comes up with an answer to that, which basically is revelation is consistent. Therefore, we should use the written revelations of God, the Bible, to judge revelations that we're having today. Friends also seek escape from persecution, not only by lobbying to have persecuting laws repealed, but by establishing Quaker colonies in the New World. The first of these is founded in New Jersey, but the most important, of course, is William Penn's Pennsylvania. He gets a charter from King Charles in 1681. Quakers have arrived there even earlier. Penn himself comes over to Pennsylvania in 1682, seeing it as a holy experiment where people of all faiths will live together in mutual harmony and mutual toleration. And a final response of friends to persecution is to try to convince the English government that Friends are not a threat because Friends feel led by God to repudiate all forms of physical violence and warfare. This is most articulately set forth in a declaration that was drawn up by a number of Quakers, including George Fox, in London in the winter of 1660-1661, basically saying that Friends were called on to be followers of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ had called on his followers to love their enemies, to turn the other cheek, to resist not evil. Therefore, Friends, when confronted with evil, could not use physical warfare to resist it. They could do so only spiritually. This, of course, meant that they were not a threat to King Charles and the English government because they would never engage in armed rebellion against it. There are some cynical historians who have argued that this is really convenient, that Friends are perceived as potential revolutionaries, and so they say, no, our religion tells us that we can never engage in armed revolution. But what eventually will become known as the peace testimony, of course, is going to become fundamental to Quaker identity for the next 2 centuries. The end of persecution finally came in 1689, when the English Parliament passes an act of toleration, which essentially makes dissenting Protestant worship legal. That's followed up by a law in 1696, which allows Friends, specifically, to offer affirmations instead of legal oaths in court and legal settings. George Fox himself died in 1691. Margaret Fell, who had married George in 1669 herself, survived until 1702. But by the 1690s, it's clear that Quakerism is changing. No longer are Friends aggressive evangelists, as they had been in the 1650s, although they continue to make some converts. Instead, after 1690 and continuing into the early 19th century, we're entering into a new period, what historians usually refer to as a period of quietism. And here you certainly see continuities. Friends still emphasize the inward light, direct revelation, plainness, worship based on waiting worship, and an unordained non-clerical class ministry. But no longer do you hear much about the Lamb's War. Instead, you find new practices and emphases either developing or being cemented, being affirmed. One of these is birthright membership. Originally, you were a Quaker if you said you were a Quaker and were regarded by other people as Quakers. By the 1730s, that, however, has developed into a system where any child born to Quaker parents has a full right of membership at birth. Unlike most other denominations, you don't have to be confirmed or undergo some ritual of publicly pronouncing yourself an adult member when you reach a certain age. In the Quaker world, if you're born to Quaker parents and you follow the rules, you'll be a Quaker for the rest of your life. You don't have to do anything else. By the early 18th century, Quakers have also developed a set of rules that all Friends are expected to follow, a set of rules that are embraced in books that are called disciplines. Today, we usually call them books of faith and practice. And these are largely concerned with prohibitions on Quaker behavior, attending places of worldly diversion, bearing arms, engaging in worldly vain address, using the world's language of you to a single person, or using worldly vain titles. There are some Quaker prohibitions that you would have found in other religious denominations at the time. For example, Quakers do not dance or attend places where stage plays are being played out. And of course, there are prohibitions on drunkenness or fornication or adultery that you would have found among virtually all religious groups at this time. Probably the most distinctive Quaker prohibition is the prohibition on marrying a non-Quaker. Friends are expected to marry only within the group. The argument is that if you have parents of different religious persuasions, then this will confuse children and may lead them to repudiate religion entirely. So if you marry a non-Quaker, unless you apologize, you will lose your membership. The result of this is that you have an increasing emphasis on inward purity, on maintaining practices and standards that mark Quakers as a peculiar people. Now, today, I think we usually would regard peculiar as not being a compliment. But for Friends well into the 19th century, peculiar is exactly what they want to be because it marks them as being set apart from a larger world that is full of unchristian and anti-Christian practices. So the result is that in the 18th century, there is an increasing emphasis on having and enforcing rules. And this means that in every generation on both sides of the Atlantic, thousands of birthright Friends are disowned for various violations of the rules or discipline. By far, the most common of these violations was for marrying out of meeting to a non-Quaker, or even marrying another Quaker in a non-Quaker ceremony. But there were lots of other ways you could get yourself disowned: for bearing arms in time of war, for going to dances or stage plays, for wearing vain and worldly dress. In many places, you could even get yourself disowned for putting up a tombstone for a loved one in a graveyard. That was regarded as being a worldly vanity. Nevertheless, despite the massive disownments, the number of Quakers probably continued to increase over the course of the 18th century because of a very high birth rate, especially in America. In a world where families routinely have 8 or 10 or 12 children, you can disown half of them when they become adults, and your numbers are still going to increase. There's also a paradox going on here. At the same time, the Quakers are increasingly focused on maintaining inward purity. They are also increasingly offering a critique of practices and social institutions that they find to be contrary to the teachings of Christianity and the will of God. It's in the 18th century that Quakers become widely and increasingly identified as philanthropists, humanitarians, and reformers. And this takes a number of forms. Over here in North America, Friends had always repudiated engaging in warfare with Native Americans, with Indians. It was one of Pennsylvania's proudest boasts that from the time William Penn arrived until the year 1656, Pennsylvania was the only colony that had not had an Indian war. Over the course of the 18th century, Friends will come to regard it as their role to appear anytime a treaty is being negotiated between colonists and Native Americans to make sure that the negotiations are fair, in particular to make sure that the written form of the treaty is the same thing that Native Americans who can't read think that they are agreeing to. Friends also become interested in establishing schools, and when Native Americans show a receptiveness to adopting white ways of life, particularly family farming, setting up model farms. This, of course, is controversial today, but by the standards of the 18th century, it's far in advance of what you would have found in non-Quaker groups. It's also in the 18th century that Quakers become identified with prison reform on both sides of the Atlantic. Indeed, some of the Western world's leading prison reformers of the 18th and early 19th centuries, like Elizabeth Fry in England or John Griscom here in the United States, are leaders of the movement to move penal institutions away from being solely places of punishment and toward places of reform, less prisons and more reformatories. Quakers are also leaders in the movement for humane treatment of the insane and mentally ill. The asylums that Friends established, first in England and then here in the United States in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, are pioneering because they believe that mentally ill people shouldn't simply be chained up or locked up, as they usually were before the mid 18th century, but instead that they should be given treatment of fresh air, good food, and kindness, and that this is more likely to lead to recovery. And it's in the second half of the 18th century the Quakers become leaders in the anti-slavery movement that is developing in Western Europe and North America. George Fox, as early as the 1670s, had indicated some qualms about the practice of slaveholding. Although he didn't actually repudiate it, he instead urged kind treatment of slaves, especially in the Caribbean. In 1688, a group of Quakers in Germantown, Pennsylvania, produced the first public petition arguing that Quakerism is incompatible with enslavement, that Friends should free the slaves that they are holding. It takes a while for that to sink into the larger Quaker world. Other agitators appear, like Benjamin Lay, an English friend who moved to Philadelphia around 1730 and becomes a notorious critic of enslavement and slaveholders, and in fact, an advocate of direct action. In one case, he actually kidnapped the children of a slaveholding Quaker family, released them the next day, but just wanted their parents to understand how slave parents felt when they were separated from their children. That was too extreme for Quakers at the time. They disowned Benjamin, but of course today he's regarded as a great Quaker hero. More effective were two other Friends in the Philadelphia area who emerged as leaders in the Quaker world in the 1740s and 1750s. John Woolman, a tailor from Mount Holly, New Jersey, and the Quaker school teacher from Philadelphia, Anthony Benezet. Working together, they make public arguments that slavery is evil, not just because it is a violation of the Golden Rule, that nobody would want to be enslaved, therefore it is wrong to enslave other people. That is clear. But Woolman and Benezet and like-minded friends also argue that slavery is evil because of what it does to the enslaver. that slavery is violence, it is rape, it is laziness, it is often murder. Basically, that there is no human being who is good enough to have complete mastery over another human being. Therefore, slavery must be repudiated by friends, not just because it wrongs the enslaved person, but because it also is sinful, is harmful to the enslaver. And the result of this is that by the year 1784, all of the various yearly meetings of Friends in the world have ruled that no Quaker can be an enslaver. That Friends who hold slaves must emancipate them, give them their freedom unconditionally. And this, in turn, is going to lead to Friends being leaders of the anti-slavery movement on both sides of the Atlantic, right down to the American Civil War in the 1860s. Finally, after the American Revolution, you see significant population shifts in the United States as Friends begin to move west in large numbers. Quaker westward migration is different from what you see in the general patterns of American westward migration between the 1780s and the 1860s. General patterns of Western migration in the United States are due west. You have New Englanders who move into upstate New York. From there, they move into northern Ohio and Indiana and Michigan and Wisconsin. People from New Jersey and Maryland and Pennsylvania moved due west into Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, then on into Iowa. Southerners, Virginians move into Kentucky. People from the Carolinas move into Tennessee, into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. When Quakers move west, certainly New England Quakers move into New York and then into Michigan. New York Quakers, a lot of them move into Michigan. People from the Delaware Valley move due west into Ohio. But Southern Quakers, and there are a lot of Quakers in the South, particularly in North Carolina by the time of the American Revolution, when they move west, they move north and west. And this is why Indiana Quakerism in particular is going to become largely an offshoot of North Carolina Quakerism. And when Southern Friends move west after the American Revolution, they move north and west, partly because they're seeking good, cheap land, but also because of their opposition to slavery. Southern Friends, having come to the conclusion that slavery is wrong, increasingly do not want to live in slave societies. And so when they move west, they move north of the Ohio River into lands where, under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, slavery is forever banned. And if you look at the Quaker history of southwestern Ohio, generally Indiana, and on west into Illinois and Iowa and Kansas in the 19th century, it's largely an expansion of North Carolina Southern Quakerism. Well, I was told to talk for about an hour, and I think I've talked for just a little over an hour. I guess now's the time when we see if we have any questions. I'm not sure how we want to do this on Zoom, since we've got more people than I can actually see at any one time. So, questions, comments, impassioned rebuttals, whatever you're led to.
And if you have a question, feel free to just click on your chat button and perhaps type it out so that we can all see it. Tom, I was interested in the James Naylor, George Fox controversy. Here's this man who's very charismatic, James Naylor, and who at one time, from what I understand, was very close to George Fox. And then comes this falling out after the Bristol incident What can you tell us about that friendship?
Well, there's no question that Fox and Naylor had been very close. There are some arguments, or some historians who would argue today that Fox was becoming jealous of Naylor, and this explains why he wasn't very charitable or sympathetic after Naylor got himself into so much trouble after his entry into Bristol. You know, Fox makes it very clear that he thought that Naylor was misguided, and he expects Naylor to apologize to him personally for having brought Quakerism into such controversy and disrepute. There are other historians who are arguing that Naylor by 1656 was increasingly influenced by a group of charismatic women, Quaker women in London, particularly a woman named Martha Symonds, who encouraged him to challenge Fox's leadership of Quakerism. Steve Angel at the Ireland School of Religions doing some really interesting writing and research on this right now. And he's coming to the conclusion that women like Symonds saw Fox as not as supportive of women's ministry as he ought to be, and thus were looking more to Naylor for leadership as someone who would be more sympathetic to what their concerns were. Fox, on the other hand, responded that women like Symonds were simply misguided, that their support of Naylor had led him into these actions that had got him into so much trouble, and that showed why you would not want to look to him for leadership. So it's complicated, and of course, there is a lot we will never know.
Interesting. So how do they end? How does their relationship end? I know Naylor dies.
Right. Eventually they are reconciled. Um, Naylor is kept in jail in the Tower of London until 1659, and when he's released, he's basically broken in health and spirit. He doesn't try to preach much after he's released, and he dies in the year 1660. In his last days, he left a few writings which are quite moving as expressions of reliance on divine guidance and humility. Um, it appears that he and Fox were reconciled, but he's pretty much a broken man after 1656.
Tom, I got a question. Um, how did Quaker business processes come about, and how did we land on a sense of the meeting, sometimes called consensus? Was that about the inner light?
Um, that's a good question, and we don't know as much about how these practices developed in the 17th century as we would like. But basically, um, Fox at one point said that meetings to do church business should be different from what you would experience in a meeting of a town council or even a parish council, where people get together to advocate secular interests and their own interests. Instead, when friends meet to do the business of the church, They should see it as an extension of worship, that they should be presided over by a godly clerk who will discern what the will of God is, not on the basis of a majority vote, because majority votes can often be wrong, or simply because someone makes a ruling on the basis of status, such as the Lord Mayor or a provost marshal simply making a ruling from authority. Instead, friends should seek to determine what the will of God is, and that involves waiting, seeking, uh, determining from what various friends are led to share where God is taking them. The frustrating thing about this is that we have hundreds of sets of minutes of Quaker business meetings that begin in the 17th century, but they only reflect conclusions. They don't tell us much about the processes that are being followed.
Thanks, Tom.
Tom, we're so grateful for your willingness to be with us. We look forward to part 2 next month, the first Sunday in February, and what you have to tell us then.